State Representative Jean Wu, District 137 in the Texas House. Fort Bend was predominantly under Republican control, led by older white individuals throughout its history. Then suddenly, the African American, Asian, and Latino communities rose and declared enough. Since the onset of COVID, our community has witnessed an unprecedented surge in anti-Asian hate crimes. Violence against our community has surged by 700%. We will unite as a coalition and we will vote. Jeffrey L. Boney, City Council Member, Missouri City, Texas. In one of my subdivisions, Vicksburg, the residents, particularly African Americans, have long sought to have their voices heard. State Representative Penny Morales Shaw, 148 District in the Texas House of Representatives. No vote, no voice. In my election, I faced 5 contests and ultimately emerged victorious by a margin of 200 votes. If your vote didn't hold significance, there wouldn't be such aggressive legislation aimed at restricting voting rights. A.G. Durrani, Treasurer, 𝐔𝐘𝐒. In the 2020 Georgia election, Biden clinched victory by a margin of 12,000 votes, with 61,000 Muslims casting their ballots. Had they not supported him, he might not have carried Georgia. Do not abstain from this election. Engage and vote now. The Muslim vote can serve as a deciding factor determining victory margins in these elections. The active participation of ethnic communities in the democratic process is pivotal, and events such as this briefing serve to underscore their impact on shaping our political future.
Welcome, everyone, to today's briefing with Houston Ethnic Media in collaboration with Ethnic Media Services. I'm Sandy Close, EMS Director, and your moderator for today's online briefing. With Super Tuesday primaries just weeks away and voting already underway, people ask themselves, why does my vote count? Voter turnout in Harris County and Fort Bend has been on the decline over the last decade, and it's prompting speculation that people are losing confidence in the electoral process or just don't see the value of making the effort to vote. Today, we've invited veteran legislators, themselves on the front lines of seeking change through the electoral process. A longtime community leader, a city council member, and a top election official to share personal experiences about why your vote indeed does count. And this is particularly directed at ethnic voters, and particularly now at a time when really the ethnic vote can make a huge and decisive difference.
I am Tanisha Hudspeth, Chief Elections Official of Harris County, the 3rd largest county in the nation and the largest county in the state of Texas. And what is important, what is happening right now is that we are in the middle of Texas primaries, Texas primary elections. And there are primaries happening across the nation right now. In the state of Texas, we have open primaries. That means voters can choose to vote Democrat or Republican. You don't have to register by that party, particularly in Texas. You can choose what primary to vote in. Early voting began on Tuesday, February the 20th. And so far, out of 2.5 million registered voters, only over 30,000 have voted early in person and voted by mail in the state of Texas. So again, we started early voting Tuesday. We are receiving mail ballots. And since then, over 30,000 out of 2.5 million registered voters have voted this far. Early voting ends March 1st. Typically, early voting is 11 to 12 day time frame in which voters can choose to vote. What's important about Texas primaries, obviously primaries across the nation, is voters decide who will be the main nominees on the November ballot. And so what we have seen in terms of trends or how people get activated in primaries, those tend to be a little bit more educated voters, right? Individuals who know the power of their local state representatives, which I am so excited to be here on with some of my colleagues and some community members who are really doing the hard work in the community. And so what we have been able to accomplish here in Harris County for the first time ever in the history of Harris County is a joint primary where the two political parties have come together to say we're going to serve voters the same way that we typically serve them to some extent in a November election. We will do that on election day here. So again, in Harris County, we have 79 early voting sites for the 12 days of early voting. So that's a big deal with a county this large. And on election day, there'll be more than 545 polling locations for voters to vote at on election day at any one of our voting locations. Friday is the last day for individuals to apply for a ballot by mail if they qualify for a ballot by mail. But what's most important is getting voters activated to understand that this is just one election that continues throughout the entire year until we get to November.
Look, you said at the beginning, maybe people feel like their votes don't matter or anything like that. I'm here to tell you it absolutely does. And I think this is especially important for the minority community, for the ethnic community to know this. You just take a look at Fort Bend. Fort Bend was a broadly controlled by Republicans and by like old white dudes for like the entire history of Fort Bend. And then all of a sudden, African-American community, Asian community, Latino community rose up and said, enough. We want to have control over our own lives. We want to have a say. We want a piece of the pie too. And so voters came out and flipped the county. All right? And people said, oh, this is just a one-time thing. It's never going to happen again. We kept it. The people who got elected kept getting elected. And this is a true show of what happens when we come together as a community, when people of color, when people who are immigrants joining with people who are Native Americans, joining together and saying, we want to have a voice. And this is so important for ethnic media to report on, right? To say that when we come together, we can do great things. Now, look, I'm going to focus a lot more on the Asian community, but this is a dangerous time for all ethnic communities, for all immigrant communities, for all communities of color. This is a dangerous time. You've watched, and I don't know if you're paying attention, but if you were, you would have watched the Republican-controlled state house, the Republican-controlled Congress roll things back that our communities fought for, that our communities, our leaders, our forefathers and foremothers bled and died for. All those things are very quietly in the middle of the night being rolled back, being taken away, and you're being told, just shut up and accept it. And if you don't know that this is happening, you need to wake up, you need to start paying attention, because this is something that's very important for the communities that you report to.
Real quickly, everybody's probably heard the saying, all politics is local. That was from former Democratic House Speaker Tip O'Neill. And in essence, what it simply means is that everything that truly affects you mostly takes place at the local level. And so taxation without representation is a horrible position for any of us to be in. So if ever there was a time to vote, that time is now, because all key decisions and all pieces of legislation that impact every one of us on a daily basis are made by individuals, regular people, just like you and I, who are voted and elected at the local, county, state levels of government. And so elected officials have the ability to appoint people to other key positions, as well as enact laws that will undoubtedly affect the quality of life for everybody, including those who don't vote. And so the detrimental outcome of people of ethnic descent choosing to completely disengage from the political process and choosing not to vote is a costly one, because a non-vote is still relevant and just as powerful as if a vote was actually cast, whether it's the judge who has the power to sentence your loved one to a lengthy prison sentence, or the judge who's responsible for dealing with a lawsuit, or the judge who has the power to determine what your child support payments and visitation rights look like through the family courts. One or more of these judges could very well be elected in a position that affects your life in some shape, form, or fashion in the very near future. So with that being said, I take my role as a local elected official, a city council member, very, very serious, in that I know that public policy wise, I make decisions that impacts all of my citizens in Missouri City, Texas, whether it's their taxes. And I can point to two particular examples from an ethnic standpoint, particularly African American community wise, how I was able to enact change that's going to impact African Americans as well as all members of the minority community and women, women as well.
I would just say to voters that, you know, voting rights didn't come easy. First of all, that has probably been said by some of the speakers that were before me, but we can't take that for granted. I often hear people say, well, I'm just one vote. Well, elections are won and lost by one vote or just a few more than one vote. And it's often because of people thinking that their vote doesn't matter and not going to the poll. But if you've got 100 people thinking that way or 1,000, then that certainly can change the outcome of an election. In my election, I had 5 races, the special runoff, the primary runoff, and the general. And ultimately, I won by 200 votes. And that may seem like a lot of votes, but in a big picture, when you're talking about, you know, thousands of votes, that isn't that many votes. And so every vote matters, but we've all heard of races where there's been 5 votes or 12 votes, and you just amazed that just that few votes can change an outcome. So that's the first thing I would say, is for people to really shed that mentality that their vote doesn't count. In fact, this is one of the key chances for people's voice to be directly input into the political process. You know, when we're up debating at the Capitol on bills and on issues and policy and all of those things, your voice matters because we're there to represent you. But this is your opportunity to be directly involved in the political process and say, you know, who you think is going to represent your voice the best. And when we don't vote, you're basically giving away your vote to another side that you may not appreciate how they represent you, or they may not represent you at all. So it's important to make your selection of who you think will be your voice when you're at work to pay your rent or your mortgage, or you're taking your kids to school, or you're taking care of your dog or your cat. And when you're taking care of your own health, you know that somebody is in that political office representing your voice because you voted for them. You went and you vetted them, or you hooked up with an organization who vetted them, and you know that they're representing the things that you believe in, whether that's at county level, state level, federal level, all of it.
I'm Ajay Durrani, the founder chair of 𝐶𝐒 Texas, currently is treasurer, and the first Muslim and the only Muslim elected to the Democratic National Committee. I'm going to use a set of PowerPoint slides to project my message. So here I'm going to go ahead and bring that on. Hopefully you'll be able to see it. There we are. The comments that I'm going to be making are going to be separated into 3 segments. What has been our outreach prior to 2020? What happened in 2020? And then, of course, what is the current outlook for Muslims, especially in view of the Gaza situation. There has been some comments made that Muslims should basically sit out these elections. There's also been, what kind of message can we have for Muslims to go to these primary elections, other local and down ballot races to emphasize, and what actions can be taken for the next elections. Can we go to the next slide, please? So prior to 2005, there was no collective outreach for Muslims here in Texas. And in 2006, 𝐶𝐒, and actually its predecessor, 𝐸merge USA, was established. Also in the same year, 3 Muslims and another AAPI, so a total of 4, were elected to the State Democratic Executive Committee, and then obviously my election in 2016 as the sole Muslim on the Democratic National Committee. One of the things that has probably not come about is that any kind of outreach work, voter outreach work, requires funding. And prior to 2016, 𝐶𝐒 had limited funding. However, it had been working closely with other AAPI organizations, and recognizing its collaborative work, we started to get grants from foundations in 2016, and that has obviously led to a step-level change as to what we have been able to do. Next slide, please. So our emphasis originally was, and I'm not going to go over everything on this slide, but our emphasis initially was to increase voter registration. Muslim voter registration in the greater Houston area was around 60%. We worked over the last 4 years and from 2016 to 2020, and increased voter registration by 35% here in our area, to the point where right now the voter registration among the Muslims is over 75%. However, we don't take that for granted. Every single week, our staff is out doing voter registration. Next slide. So the real question is, what has come about from all these efforts? This is a busy slide. I'm going to only talk about the upper half of the slide, which is Muslim voter turnout in 2012, which is the white line, the 2016 turnout, which is the blue line, and the 2020 turnout, which is the red line. We use the normal get out the vote techniques that most of the people do, but we also utilize our ethnic media. For 7 straight weeks, 𝐵𝐔𝐄 placed full-page ads, different messages in 4 separate South Asian ethnic media to identify and also to get our message out. We also used 2 weeks of 1-hour radio during prime time during the early voting period to also again get the message out. We also had some TV ads. But if you look at this chart over here, some of our voter percentages was in the 50%, 55% in the presidential elections of 2012. By 2016, we have started to increase. And I know that the county clerk, Tanisha Hudspeth, has said that the voter turnout has been falling off in Harris and Fort Bend County. But as far as the Muslims are concerned, our voter turnout has actually gone up. Just as an average from 2016 to 2020, we increased our turnout by 5% from an average of 66 to 71%. And some of our suburban counties like Fort Bend and Collin County in the Dallas area were in the mid to high 70s. It's almost unheard of for a whole area to have anything like 70% turnout, but that we have been able to affect over here, primarily because of the effort of getting a very specific message out to our community. Next slide. So people might say, well, wait a minute, your community is relatively small. How can it have an impact? Well, in the 2020 election in Georgia, Biden won by 12,000 votes. 61,000 Muslims had voted. If they had not voted in him in favor, he may not have won Georgia. Same thing with Pennsylvania. The total amount of votes that Biden got were well exceeded by the people, the Muslims who voted. Michigan and Wisconsin are similarly on the edge. And in Arizona, there were more Muslims who had voted than Biden got votes. So bottom line, in states where elections are coming down to tens of thousands of votes, the Muslim vote can be a swing factor, the margin of victory. And more so in these elections, most elections happen to be very narrow.